So Mark Conchar and I would like to welcome you to the presentation titled The First 100 Days, Creating a Framework of Teamwork, Reporting, and Controls to Establish Project Success. So I'd like to start out and look at the anatomy of a failure. This was a large and complex project. It was a $350 million project that was $100 million over budget. The client called our company in to look at how might we turn this thing around. We used an assessment called the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team. It's built on Patrick Lencioni's work, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. What it allows us to do is pinpoint the behavior breakdowns within a project team. And what I didn't realize is that this was the most dysfunctional team that I had ever come across. The trust category was completely broken down. There was no openness, no vulnerability, no goodwill left in this team. The ability to have positive conflict, instead of having productive conflict, this was toxic warfare that they were experiencing. There was no real commitment to the job. In fact, there were factions and people committed to different individuals on the project. The accountability level had broken down. Everybody had started playing the game on shifting the blame to other people and hiding in the activities. And then finally, the results. The results had completely broken down at this point. Now, when we looked at the qualitative information behind this assessment, we found something very interesting. This was an 11-person leadership team. 10 of the 11 individuals said that in order to improve our outcomes, we need to let go of grudges. But that wasn't the real issue. The real issue is if you look to the far right-hand side, the bottom part, the last 2 items, 0 out of 11 wanted to spend more time together, and only 1 out of 11 wanted to get to know people at a personal level. That was the real problem, and that's how broken this project had become. So let me introduce ourselves to you. My name is Rex Miller. I run an organization called MindShift. I've been in the industry for 41 years. I started as a project manager for Southwestern Bell. But in 2008, I led a research project around the dysfunctional nature of traditional project delivery, and it produced a book called The Commercial Real Estate Revolution. It was written at an owner's level, and it was written to help owners understand how the structure of procurement and the traditional project delivery models we were using were producing predictably unreliable results. I met Mark Conchar in 2008 as well, and he had been doing this kind of research since the 1990s, and he did his PhD in this. So I'm going to turn this over to Mark so he can introduce himself to you and a little bit about the work that he has done and what led him into this work.
So as Rex mentioned, since the early 90s, I've been studying project delivery. And like many of you, my experience over the years has also shaped my beliefs about our business and the headroom which exists for improvement. In fact, when I was a graduate student at Penn State, Victor Sanvito and I led the first empirical comparison of project delivery systems in the United States, a study which frankly uniquely launched design build onto the scene and was critical in opening new procurement laws across the country. This work was later published in papers and in a book format, and it very much shaped my thinking. Now, over 20 years later, in my senior role at Balfour Beatty, I continue to carry a few key beliefs. The first being that every project is custom, and the fact that what we know is not always what we do. And the more time that we can spend intentionally designing, aligning, and sustaining project teams for the betterment of the project and the people involved, the more enjoyable they are overall. And the concept of being custom every time is powerful. It means that every project is unique. It's a new team, it's a new conditions, new context, new geography, new design, new economic cycle. Everything is new. And because of this, every owner faces critical decisions about their project. Chief to the earliest choices, however, includes picking a team, a procurement system itself, the commercial terms by which the team will be governed, and settling on the project delivery system. For years, research has taught us that regardless of the delivery system, project success is achievable. However, the likelihood of that success is greatest when we get these decisions right. Said another way, all the big mistakes often happen on day one. And what leading owners have discovered is that these few choices alone and the way in which they are administered have an enormous impact on the ultimate outcome of a project. Why? We believe these factors greatly impact two distinct things. First, the project culture. And we're going to talk about some case studies and some stories today that exemplify why culture is so important. Essentially, how do things really happen around here on this project? And the second is setting the foundation, the recipe for high performance for teams. In a sense, we recognize the owner as being the driving force to establishing a pathway for that team performance. So where will this take us? Today, we will explore some common pitfalls and chronic issues faced by most project teams and their owners. We will cover getting over the forming storming hump, and specifically we'll anchor this presentation on the 7 keys to getting things done. Again, putting things in place to give the team their highest chance of success. Back in 2012, we did an internal study at our organization, Balfour Beatty, when we found that several projects were hotspots. They were frankly not going well. And 100% of the time, we found out that when projects begin poorly, they absolutely are going to end badly. There's no doubt about it. So what we conspired to do internally was to focus on the first 100 days of the project as a highly intentional way of getting our team positioned for success, despite, again, the project delivery system, how we were procured, or the challenges that faced us. What we know today is that every project team has different kinds of people coming to the table. In fact, Gallup indicates that of 10 people, there's going to be 3 people who are highly engaged. These are the people who are volunteering for extracurricular activities. They are constantly pulling others along with them. There's 5 others in the center of the boat who are good people. They're well-intentioned. However, if you don't come by every week, every 2 weeks, and tell them to pick up their oar and continue paddling, you're likely going to get suboptimal performance. And frankly, there's 2 there on every team, as remarkable as that sounds, who are actually driving a hole in the boat, and you'd be better off leaving them at home. So we recognize that our job as leaders on projects and in organizations is to maximize the amount of engagement within the project team. One of the ways we do this is through a Smart Start program. Again, it's designed to combat root causes. And when we looked at several projects inside our organization, you won't be surprised to recognize some of the surface problems. These are the lagging indicators that often throw up flags when it's too late. When we scratched around a bit more, we found some of the underlying causes: poor planning, late decision-making, communication challenges, or something as simple as bad or poorly designed meetings. But what we were really after was finding the root causes. And what we found, much like the anatomy of a failure story that Rex told, things like interpersonal conflicts, people being challenged with motivation or not knowing what to work on, priority setting, decision-making protocol, or just frankly, unclear processes or expectations amongst the project team. So we combated this by intentionally designing the way in which meetings are conducted and the prioritization of strategies within the first 100 days.
So when we go back to that anatomy of a failure, there were many external problems taking place, but the root cause got back to the relationship dynamic between the project manager on the left-hand side here, called the super driver, and then the general superintendent on the right-hand side, called the sage. Now, I won't go into this assessment tool. It's the Clifton Strengths, and we use an application called Core Clarity to get this color coding. But what it illustrates is just how different these 2 individuals were. And the super driver, or the project manager, was very good at building cohesion and then directing people, very hands-on. The project manager, on the other hand, was also very good with people. Those are the blue-colored strengths. And his green strengths are, of course, his cognitive strengths. So you can see you've got somebody that's very hands-on and just directive versus somebody that's very reflective before they act. So that was a dynamic setup that created even more trouble. But the root cause was a common strength they each had, and it's the ownership strength called responsibility. The project manager was saying to himself and to everybody, this is my job. It will be done the way I want it to. But the general superintendent, with his responsibility strength, was saying, this is my team. If you want it to get done, it needs to be done my way. Now, we spent a whole day with this project team. And when these two individuals finally saw the root cause of the challenge and how they were misinterpreting one another's intentions, it was a true breakthrough. In fact, it was almost a Kleenex moment. It so blew away the owner watching how dramatically it turned. And it turned because there was this deep understanding. Most teams do not take the time on the front end to really understand how people are wired, how they will respond under conflict, and how they might naturally collide or where the natural friction points are. And they don't do what we call rules of engagement. They don't create a playbook ahead of time to know that when these kinds of tensions raise their head, we know what they are. We know what the pattern looks like, and we have a way of dealing with it. So what happens is we're structurally designed to be adversaries. This is what we discovered in the early work of the commercial real estate revolution. We brought a collection of leaders in the industry, all from different seats on the bus, so to speak. We had the developer, we had the owner, we had the architect, we had the broker, we had all these different areas. And we simply asked a question. It's a simple question. What does the problem look like on your seat on the bus? And here's what we found. And here's the underlying dynamic taking place in most project teams. The contractor said, if only the architect would deliver drawings complete, we wouldn't have these problems. And then I had the architect, two principals from the largest architectural firm in the world, speak up. If only the contractor knew how to read the plans and understood design intent, we wouldn't have these problems. And then it got passed off to the developer. If only they wouldn't sandbag on the budget, or the owner. If only they wouldn't change their minds 100 times. This was the dynamic that took place for a few hours until we began to see the system was driving this kind of fragmentation, silos, and distrust. And then this brings us into what we call the forming, storming hump. Now, in a typical project, there are 4 stages every project goes through. This is called the Tuckman model. It's forming, we come together. I like to call that the romance stage. Then there's the storming phase where the romance turns into reality and we have to work out our differences and normalize our processes. And then we get into this norming and performing. And so what happens is we get caught in the forming, storming loop. One of the national contractors did research and studied, what does this forming, storming loop cost? And what they said is it costs somewhere between 6 to 9 months to work into that norming phase at a cost of about 5 to 7% of the cost of the project. So we knew that structurally, traditional design, bid, build projects set up this hump. And the challenge was bringing people in early on the process to have that early knowledge and build that collaboration model. This is an illustration of the phases of a traditional design, bid, build project and the phases in what's become known as the trust-based early collaborative models. And there are several out there. But what we found is in these trust-based collaborative models over the years, we found some were more successful than others. And the key was the first 100 days. We'll provide a PDF of both the timeline and this graph of what gets done. The challenge, however, is that in the initial intents of the project, the owner has good intention, all the players have good intentions, but those good intentions need something to hold them to reality. And those are the 7 principles for what gets done. So here are the 7, and we'll go in detail as we go into the presentation. First of all, what gets pictured gets done. What gets modeled gets done. What gets scheduled gets done. What gets financed or resourced gets done. What gets trained gets done. What gets measured gets done, and what gets celebrated gets done. And if any one of these 7 are missing, we typically find that a project will struggle. So now let's move into the first one. What gets pictured gets done. Owners in this role give a vivid picture of what they hope to accomplish, but also the why behind the project, even the business model, what's driving the need for this project. And it's very important that owners reinforce this over a long period of time, because we can remember the initial vision, the initial good intentions, that initial meeting, but unless it's reinforced consistently and reinforced in creative ways, that picture begins to fade.
One of the most fascinating case studies was the Edith Green Wendell Wyatt Federal Building. And what made it so unique was the fact that they created massive innovations in many areas around sustainability and team building. Patrick Bruner, the executive in charge, was a GSA employee and was set out to change the way GSA managed their projects by using the Edith Green building as an example of what could be done in the federal government. And the way in which Patrick modeled the behaviors and the expectations was taking the GSA's CMC, construction manager as constructor project delivery system, and adding 6 important components. And he beat the drum on these 6 over and over and over as a means to model what was expected for this project team. And they included things like allowing the prime to propose up to 5 critical first tiers as part of the original CMC selection, which was unheard of in the federal government. An emphasis on craft labor, integrated document development with the primary players of the project, not just the GSA. A focus on community outreach, project labor agreements, Department of Labor, and changing the GSA mega project protocols. Aftercare phase, again, looking at what life would be like post-construction and being a learning team, which we'll talk about later. So Patrick's intent was to be very focused on modeling the things that he expected and was going to use the laws at his disposal to change the way project delivery could happen at GSA.
So with the Edith Green Wendell Wyatt project, Patrick Bruner not only painted a vivid picture of how the process and the structure would be different, but modeled it as well. And what we see that Patrick Bruner did is, first, he pictured the project in terms of how it would be different than traditional ways of doing things. And he also modeled it by his behavior. And we'll see that the Edith Green Wendell Wyatt project is a real prototype for all 7. But right here, we're focusing on what gets pictured. And the challenge with what gets modeled is oftentimes the owner will say they want an open, trust-based, collaborative approach. However, they may not share the real cost of the project, or they may revert back to the command and control processes if they're not getting exactly what they want as quickly as they want, and not trust the team to develop to do that. So it's very important. Modeling is walking the talk, and it starts with the owner.
One of the most powerful ways to set up modeling to be successful is to co-create what it is that you actually want to model. One of the most important areas of Smart Start, in my opinion, is what we call values alignment. And think of it this way. One of the first several meetings when the major players are assembled for a project, imagine if you could sit down and ask the client what's most important about the project, or what are the values that this team really holds dear to themselves. Again, these could be strangers, or they could be people that know each other from past projects. We've settled on 3 very important questions to ask the team in an open environment and debate them. And these questions include, what is most important to you about how we interact? Okay, the important piece to that question is how we interact. What are the expectations that we all want to model about our behaviors and the interactions we take as a team? Question 2 is a future cast type question. When completed, how will you measure if this project is a success? Will it be based on parameters that the owner sets, on leading or lagging indicators that each individual firm or person has? let's agree on what we will consider to be success based on measurable variables. And the third question is, in your experience, what is the most critical factor in high performance team? So think back to your last project, 2 projects, many of your projects, and think about the best experiences you've had. Can you articulate what the environment was like? What are the factors that were put into place? And can we agree on which of those we intentionally established on this project? So we have found that asking 2 or 3 or 4 kind of open-ended questions, most importantly, as a group, and agreeing to what those will be, is super helpful in terms of people's ability to model that as new people come and go from the project, and as others want to learn about the culture of this project.
So now we're at a dividing point. These next 2 we've combined together because this is typically where this goes sideways for teams. They start with good intentions. They picture the outcome and they model and walk the talk. And the very first thing that has to happen is breaking out the time on a calendar before the pressure of moving forward and getting things done hits. And unless it's properly resourced, unless the budget is there to do this early alignment and training, then it's good intentions again. So often what I find as a consultant is that I hear great intentions of team alignment and training early in the job. And as we get closer and closer to the project teams coming together, it gets cut shorter and shorter and shorter. And unless you've properly resourced it, this only becomes good intentions. So these 2 are the turning point to making this successful.
So what's so special about what Patrick did with the Edith Green team is he knew this and dedicated upwards of 8 weeks for this forming, storming hump, if you will, and broke the conversation down into commercial strategies, leadership strategies, and logistical and process tactics. And when you look back at some of the things this team co-discovered together, it's interesting to recognize that given the federal state of things at that point, things like guaranteed maximum price contracts, while that existed for this project, the team set performance goals, and even though they were not in the contract, right? So you begin to get a sense of how powerful the bonding was or the culture was around some of the principles of the CMC plus 6. In the leadership strategies category, investment in upfront team building and onboarding when new players began to be selected and joined the project team. They didn't just let them show up, they coached them in terms of what the expectations were, what the vision was, and what was expected to be modeled day in and day out. Over in the logistical and process tactics, you see things like co-location, shared information rooms, BIM snapshots, and process flow charts to discover what is the wasted time and energy in what we normally would do that we can carve out, save each other time, and save the project money. So it was very interesting to me to look back and read the case studies that have been written about this particular project and recognize how vital it was to dedicate time on the calendar and resource to get these things done.
So when we look at what the real success factor was, it goes back to that training time that Patrick Bruner put in with the team. And when we interviewed the members of the team, one of the hardest things for them to feel was that they were actually being productive during that 6 to 8 weeks of just training, working through the details, finding the constraints. But what it gave them was clarity about execution, and it gave them the confidence. So they didn't have to be constrained by the contract. They had enough confidence where they could exceed the contract, and they actually did. And several of the items that were once valued out of the project, they brought them back into the project because of that confidence. They were able to focus on the performance of the team, not just meeting contract minimum requirements, but exceeding and going beyond that.
Another great example of what gets trained is from the Pavilion for the University of Pennsylvania Health System, a massive IPD healthcare project on the East Coast. And we have Amanda Patton, Manager of Integrated Projects from Balfour Beatty, to describe the story.
Hi, I'm Amanda Patton. an 18-year veteran of Balfour Beatty and a manager of integrated projects on the Penn First team, building the pavilion for Penn Medicine. I've spent the last 5.5 years working on this iconic project, which includes 504 patient rooms, 47 interventional spaces, 61 ED treatment rooms, 3 bridges, a tunnel, and 690 below-grade parking spaces, all totaling 1.5 million square feet. It's a true IPD project with a multi-party agreement between our owner, 2 great architects, HDR and Foster & Partners, a skilled MEP engineer, NBR+A, our GC joint venture of Balfour Beatty and Elliff Driscoll, as well as key trade contractors making up 51% of the subcontracted work. This team, known as Penn First, started our journey using a version of our Smart Start process to define value and the guiding principles for the project. These early sessions aligned the team around these principles. We even signed a covenant that we all developed together. This commitment was the foundation of our work together and provided a true north, one that was all about serving the project and not about our individual priorities. As the team grew, we knew onboarding was critical. We developed an onboarding program that focused on an introduction to Penn Medicine and provided a why for our everyday work, a clear message of the guiding principles and what that meant for our how decisions would be made, and an understanding of how the use of lean methodologies and integrated delivery would impact our daily tasks. We've continued to provide training on tools and processes like target value design and A3 thinking, focusing on continual improvement, and training on softer topics like servant leadership and the importance of respecting everyone's input and perspective. We use the HBDI assessment to better understand our teammates and find ways to work together more effectively. We come from different parts of the industry, and unsurprisingly, we see things and approach problems very differently. While that's part of what makes an integrated team strong, it can also create communication challenges. Using a tool like HBDI allowed us to have a language around our ways of thinking and working that facilitated better communication and a more unified team. All of this has created a culture that encourages each other to reach across the aisle and break down the traditional barriers that often exist in our industry and on our projects. I'm honored to have served on this team and so proud of what we've built so far, both the building and the entity known as Penn First.
So again, the importance of the first 100 days was recognized by project leadership, in this case, the IPD team, as to how they were going to invest time and energy to train and onboard people to the project as this job really got moving.
Now we move into what gets measured gets done, but this is a different kind of measurement structure. This is looking at leading indicators. This is a way of measuring performance that most high-performing athletes look at. They look at the process of getting to the outcomes. In other words, they look at leading indicators. If we look at schools, for example, a leading indicator is engagement. A lagging indicator are test scores. It's a hard, counterintuitive thing to look at, but I'm going to turn this over to Mark because he did this exact thing with one of his teams. And we're going to give you an example of a dashboard they created and the process they went through to come up with leading indicators on how they can become a high-performing team.
One team that we experienced on the West Coast was a team who set some common expectations about what they called team health. And when you think about the question during the values alignment phase around how do we want to interact, what common understanding of behavior do we have, this team selected 8 or 10 or 12 different variables that they wanted to track on a quarterly basis to get ahead of what could become hotspots or glitches amongst the team. They were very focused on the interpersonal dynamics because they believed that if that was running smoothly, information would flow. And if information flowed, people would be getting the things that they needed and the project would run more smoothly. So as they began to study the information, came together to look at the results, there were 5 particular variables, leading indicators that became paramount for their success. And they're listed there in the bottom right. How were they talking about trust? What did they feel around the connectedness of the team players? Was there a participating level of engagement amongst the players? What about process structure? And what about camaraderie? How was that being measured? They had several different ways to measure these things, and they used surveys to get at some of the subjective information and some of the feedback, and it became a very candid conversation. And as time wore on, quarter to quarter to quarter, they were able to see some of these variables that they focused on improve, and when they lapsed their attention, performance dropped, right? So they had a good common understanding amongst each other of how important these things were, and they were committed to making an attempt to make them better.
When we look at rounding this out, one of the things we look at, and we know that what gets celebrated gets done, what gets reinforced and rewarded. And what we look for are examples and people who are behaving towards those goals or ideals that we've set. And one of the examples I like to point to is the UCSF Children's Hospital in San Francisco. Now, this was run by Stuart Ekblatt as the owner's rep. And one of the interesting things that he did here is he brought everybody together. He brought the patients, he brought all of the trade partners together for a day to get to know each other at a very human level. One of the byproducts of this was an interesting story that Stuart shared at a conference that I was at. Now, this is a cancer hospital for children. One of the challenging health conditions in cancer is a weakened immune system. So during a punch out of a floor, Stuart saw one of the trade partners vacuuming out the dust in between the frame of a drywall. Now, he wasn't told to do that. He wasn't managed to do that. In fact, he could have closed it up and nobody would have known the difference. However, because he had seen the patients and knew the condition and knew why the hospital was being built, again, this gets back to the very first item. What gets pictured gets done. What gets modeled gets done. What gets trained gets done. All of this happened. And so this person took it upon themselves to vacuum the dust because he knew that dust compromises immune systems. It's a powerful story, and it's a powerful example of going beyond just the rudimentary, those 5 people in the boat where you have to tell them what to do, tell them how to do it, and then make sure they did it. Those people move up to the boat if you go through these 7 elements, the 7 principles of what gets done.
Through stories, examples, case studies, our experiences, we hope that we've triggered some thoughts in your mind about your project. We've emphasized why trust-based partnerships can exist. We see them today, but without a focus on the first 100 days where we base things on the owner parameters, get the team selection right, and spend the time and the dollars required to align the group, only then can you expect to achieve the 7 principles of what gets done. So to close, let's make sure we understand that there are handouts available that we reviewed, the traditional versus trust-based timeline, also the poster of the 7 what gets done. And more practice can be found at the LCI Congress, which as many of you are involved and well know is coming up at the end of October, and email addresses for both myself and Rex Miller if you'd like to explore other case studies, have questions, or would like to talk about your project, please reach out. At this point, we're going to move to questions and answers, but we thank you for participating in the first 100 days, creating a framework of teamwork, reporting, and controls to establish project success. Thank you.